Well, good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where in the world you are joining us from. My name is Eileen Goldberg, and I'll be your moderator for this afternoon's webinar, Last Planner System and Design, presented by Christian Pikel from the Realignment Group. There's a couple of housekeeping items I'd like to go over before we start. The first is that this webinar is being recorded, and a copy of the recording and the slide deck will be sent to all participants, so don't worry about that. The second is this webinar is available for AIA and AGC continuing education credits. So that they are self-report. So all attendees will receive a certificate of attendance after the presentation along with their recorded copy of the webinar. So be on the lookout for that to come into your inboxes. You will receive a copy of that certificate of attendance so you can self-report for AIA and AGC credits. You'll notice the long skinny box on the right-hand side of your screen. There's a red arrow to the left of that box. That's the minimization and maximization arrow. Please feel free to use that throughout the presentation so you can view the presentation more closely. Also at the bottom there, you'll see the questions box. Please put questions throughout the presentation you have in that box. They'll be answered at the end of the presentation. I will say that we have over 500 people on this webinar. Thank you so much for coming and joining us. So we are going to leave quite a bit of time for questions, but just in case we don't have time to answer all of them, Mr. Pikel has graciously offered to answer some in person, and he'll be getting in touch with everyone. All of the questions will be sent directly to the presenter, Mr. Pikel, after the webinar. So he will have a chance to get back in touch with you directly to answer those questions if we don't have a chance to get to them on the webinar itself. Again, just wanted to reiterate that this webinar is being recorded. A copy of the recording and the slide deck will be sent to all participants. This is self-report for any AGC or AIA credits, so you'll be receiving a certificate of attendance. You'll see the long skinny box on the right-hand side of your screen with the minimization and maximization arrow, as well as the questions box. So please be sure to be thinking of those questions and putting them in there as we go through the presentation. They'll be answered at the end, and any of them that we do not get to, Christian Pikel will answer them hopefully directly with you, as they will all be sent to him after the presentation. So without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and pass it over to Christian.
All right, thanks, Eileen. And I feel like I may need to put a governor on that promise. If there is actually a plethora of questions and it becomes overwhelming, I may just do a universal write-up and we can distribute it to the entire list. So we'll just see how much follow-up is required and if it's humanly possible to do that on a one-on-one basis. But we will try to address all the questions if possible, even at the end of this webinar. And welcome, everybody. Like Eileen said, it's a very impressive turnout today. I've been doing LCI webinars for quite a while now, and this is for sure the most I've ever had attend one of my webinars, so thank you very much. I would like to give a special shout out. There's a group attending from LCI Qatar, and I know it's late in the evening there, so thank you very much for spending your time with us. And thanks, Eileen, for the introduction. We're going to be jumping into the content here that you all want to hear about. This is specific to Last Planner System and Design. So the hope is that everybody on the webinar has at least some prior exposure or read about Last Planner System, period. We're not going to cover all of the construction-specific elements of Last Planner System, but we will talk to them in the context in which they are different and how we apply these things specifically during this design phases of the project. This has been a long time in the making. Last Planner System and Design goes back quite a few decades now, and it's in construction, it's been pretty well adopted and is much better understood. In the design phases, there's been lots of teams and people that have struggled and really worked hard to try to figure out how to make this successful. And it's absolutely still a work in progress. Every year we are learning as we are working with teams. And as a coach working with teams in this framework, I'm learning from every project when I engage as well. So I think this represents as close to the current state of knowledge that we have. And I'm going to try to inject as much of my personal experience into this as I can as well to share some of the stories and tips and experiences that I've had from lessons learned on projects. So just personally, my journey with Lean and Lean construction and Last Planner System actually began in the construction environment. My career goes back to the late 90s. I was working for a mechanical company. So I was actually on the trade side of things when we were, I think in 1997, introduced through some consultants who came into our office and said, hey, you should really start doing these weekly work plans and these look ahead plans and start measuring how well you're doing. And we said, great, one more thing to add to our pile of things that we have to do. But it ended up really building the success of that company in terms of a production planning point of view. And my career personally has taken many different turns over the years, all related to design and construction generally. And it was really in the late 2000s when I started getting engaged heavily in healthcare that I discovered projects that we were delivering now in an integrated project delivery format, sometimes with contracts, sometimes not. And then I had the pleasure of working for a healthcare owner organization that was trying to push lean through the entire delivery mechanism of the project. So from internal business case planning through design, through construction delivery, all the way through startup and commissioning, as well as trying to integrate project teams. And so a lot of my experience that I try to bring to consulting and coaching and teaching draws on that perspective that I've been able to look at this from working hand in hand with trade foremen, as well as working in big room environments and non-big room environments where we're trying to implement last planner system in all phases of projects. So for today's focus, we're going to be providing a system overview for what this looks like in design. So from an LCI journey to mastery point of view, right? If you've been through other workshops, you've probably seen this slide. And webinars like this cannot build on the full depth or give you the full depth of understanding and competency required. But at least I will try to build enough awareness and exposure to examples so that it will answer some of your questions, and hopefully it gives you enough information to seek out more and to potentially start practicing some of these tools and methods on your own projects. And that will continue the learning cycle as it does for all of us. We like to say that none of us ever actually get to mastery, because the more you learn, the more you practice, the more you discover that you still have to learn, as well as the systems are changing because we are continuously improving them year after year. Another item we need to talk about before we really get into the topic and the content is that Last Planner system is a trademark of LCI, of Lean Construction Institute. So Last Planner system as it's used, the Last Planner as the individual person and people that are working on the system, these are all trademarks. So if you do utilize Last Planner system on your project, if you are utilizing this in any kind of writings, please keep that in mind, and that the registered trademark is owned by Lean Construction Institute, and that we are able to utilize this information through the Improved Instructor Program, where we are actually acknowledged by LCI that we understand and are cognizant of the content and are capable of delivering the workshops as well. Okay, so with all of that out of the way, let's jump into what you really want to hear about. So why should we even be worried about Last Planner system and design, given the demand and the number of people that are here today? I imagine there's probably a lot of your thoughts on this as well that we could try to share. But from what we've seen on projects and my personal experience, one of the fundamental reasons of why we should be applying Last Planner system and design and why we should be doing collaborative planning in general is that we just don't talk enough. There are, in my experience, when we start developing design schedules, we start doing design production in a fairly traditional way, research and owner meetings, and start putting all that information together. So many assumptions percolate throughout the schedule and the implementation of our plans that we are often surprised by information that is created that we didn't expect. There's often a significant amount of information that gets created with assumptions built in. We don't have clear roadmaps on what decisions really need to be made when, and we have a tolerance for owners sort of lagging on decisions and often revisiting things, certainly many times in my experience, after what really already has been a last responsible moment. And we often have many different disciplines that are working very hard on projects, but they're not always working on the alignment. So a practice and a method and set of tools that helps us bring deeper alignment and understanding of what we should be doing when, brings the owner into a fluid and ongoing conversation about when input is needed, when decision making is needed. It has shown us on those projects where this is implemented, even just in the initial stages where we're really not that good at it yet, but we are starting the practice of talking more frequently and making the work plans more visual and more collaborative. Already starts to bring significant dividends. And then that keeps building as we get more practice and as the team gets better at it. So this has its roots in what led to the development of Last Planner System, which was originally designed in the construction world or for the construction world, so field work happening on the construction site. And the same sort of principles and metrics do apply to us in design, but there are going to be nuanced differences, which we'll look at. So if you're not familiar with this, what led to the original creation of the Last Planner System was when Greg Howell and Glenn Ballard were hired as consultants on projects to determine why we were having a hard time meeting schedules. We were always struggling to hit milestones. So they were engaged over, I'm not quite sure how many projects, but I know it was 3 to 4 or 5 projects across America and South America, commercial projects of substantial size and a diversity of size, where they first started looking at what the fundamental problems were. So before suggesting solutions, as good consultants should, they decided to dig in and try to get at the root causes of the problems. And one of the things that was studied was how reliable were the commitments that are made by the crews. So these are the supervisors of the field crews, the foremen, the superintendents, who are actually executing or supervising the execution of the work. And what is the reliability of those commitments from 1 week to the next? So a 1-week planning horizon. And when we talk about reliability in this context, we'll look at a couple of processes and flows that speak to that later in the presentation. But when we talk to reliability about this context, that means done when it's promised to be done and the way it's promised to be done. And as we get deeper in that conversation, when we really start to talk about workflow, that also means, did it start on time? Did it finish on time? And were there any impediments to me doing that work? So when we get into the meat of reliability, there's really quite a bit to it that we talked about. And so 54% is the average that was discovered across these projects. So slightly better than half the stuff that was promised to be completed for next week actually was completed in that way at that time. And so if you think about that in terms of a reliable flow on a project and being able to plan out my week and what I'm going to do, because what I do is dependent on what other people do, that's not a great number. So Last Planner System at the core seeks to improve that reliability. And it's not as visible to us in the pre-construction and design world, but that number, that reliability also impacts the work that I do. So before I tell you my thoughts on it, we'd like to do a quick poll of the audience. So 54% is the commitment reliability from a field point of view that came about as the average study from these projects. So I'd like to understand where the audience sits in this, where we are in design. So starting from the early days of business planning and owner concept through production design and then deliverables and permitting. How reliable do you think our teams are on a week-by-week basis? Do you think we're higher than construction, lower, or about the same? So we'll just give a little bit of time here. Eileen's going to launch this poll and give you some instructions of how to respond, and then we'll see how we are.
All right, so the poll has been launched. Again, you'll see in front of you, you've got the poll there with the 3, the higher, the lower, and about the same. Go ahead and check one, and those results are really coming in. Let's see here. We've got one that's a little bit of a front runner, Christian. We'll see what you think about that one when the results come in. Mm-hmm. We have about half of you guys that have voted, so keep those votes coming in. We're going to leave the poll open for a little bit longer.
And before you all joined, we did have a little bit of betting to see what the answer would be. We won't share with you who has how much money invested in which option, but you know, if you go my way, I'll be much certain to answer the questions even more in depth. So there's a little bit of an incentive for you.
I'm an angel. I don't know what you're talking about.
Yes, that is obviously kidding.
We're going to leave the polls open for a couple more seconds, and then we're going to go ahead and close it and show you guys the results. All right.
I am actually genuinely curious how this aligns with my perspective. So this will be really neat. This will be a good data point to take into future presentations.
All right. We're going to go ahead and close this one out, and I'm going to share the results with everybody. Christian, it looks like 41% said lower. 35% said about the same, and 25% said higher.
Okay, very interesting. So we are, at best, the same or worse than construction. So there's only a 25% confidence that we are actually beating the field construction folks in how reliable we are week after week. So thanks for participating in that. And, you know, that actually confirms sort of my perspective. And this is anecdotal. I don't have solid data to support this, but other than just me having worked with teams over the course of years, both in the owner role and in a consulting role, there's another factor that comes into play in the design world, which is, you know, part of this reliability number, both in construction and design, is how well can we plan our week, right? In construction last planner system, the theory is, and it's been borne out, that the better we get at weekly work plan reliability, the more productive our field crews are able to be. And my belief is this is also true for us in an office setting. So if we have a high expectation that when somebody on the team says, hey, I will send you that piece of information that you need in order to do your work, and you say you're starting Wednesday morning, so I will have it to you by the end of the day, Tuesday, and you can count on that. And that is a high level of reliability. That lets you plan your week better, right? My observation is that what really happens is, even in those cases where we get that information, our weeks are shook up by additional information or incomplete information, or a lot more surprises in somebody sent me something, but it wasn't actually quite the way I had expected it. So before I can get started on the work that I'm about to do, I actually have to ask some questions. And there's a few reasons why I think that happens. One is the nature of design work and the nature of our teams in design work. And we'll get into that as we start talking about last planner system. So thank you for responding to the poll and confirming my belief that, yeah, we're probably not better, and we're probably a little bit worse than we are on the construction side in terms of reliability. So this is good, and there should be a lot of value add if we can get better at implementing last planner system and design and driving that reliability up. So let's talk about where the differences are. So there's a different approach slightly in how we apply last planner system and design. And one of the reasons is that by the time you get to applying it in construction, the set of project knowledge within the team hopefully is relatively high. Hopefully we are working off of reasonably detailed and reasonably good quality construction documents. I know that can be questionable on some projects, but at least we have information to work off of. And for the most part, we can look at the building that we need to erect and agree on, or at least align on, if we don't agree on, what the correct sequence of activities is. Design is not always that linear and doesn't always follow that hard logic, especially in the earlier, very creative stages of design. So when we start planning out design work, right, we have to make allowances for the different components that make it up. Part of it is creative, and we say iterative or emergent. The more we learn about the client, the more we learn about the project, the more it may affect our next actions. Some of it becomes more similar to construction, right? As you release things into a production level of design, where we're adding details and nuts and bolts and things like that, it's more predictable. And some things we think are predictable, like when we try to manage what the plan is for external agencies that control our world in terms of permitting and document reviews and things like that. And we think there's logic to it that we can map out, but then we get surprised because we hear one thing one day and we hear another thing another day. So we have some external constraints to deal with in that context as well. So to basically adapt to those, design last planner system has evolved to this emerging information state that exists for us in design, where in construction, things are more tangible and more linear for the most part. The other element that is really a struggle and really something that we've done a lot of work on in design is that milestones, when we start breaking from tradition, are not quite as well understood in a more progressive planning environment. So what I mean by that, and we'll look at this more, is there are the traditional sort of consultant design, these are the deliverable milestones that you will meet that have been written into contracts forever. But when we start breaking that down into meaningful milestones and actually trying to roadmap what information is delivered in a flow of work format, and what are decision points that we need, and how do we get to those decisions and make them stick. We struggle a lot more with saying what are the actual meaningful milestones, whereas construction milestones are generally well understood and a little bit easier to roadmap, while there are still some changes as we get deeper into Last Planner System on the construction side that we try to encourage teams to adopt. So one of the things that's happened in the history of lean construction and developing lean Last Planner System in the design framework is that we've started looking to other industries and seeing what they do. And so one of the things that we've started doing is blending frameworks that are used in agile management, specifically what they refer to as Scrum. And agile is something that came up in sort of the product development and software development world, essentially looking at the same source material as we did. So manufacturing at Toyota, which is really where lean production first it came from, right, by observing Toyota production system, led to lean manufacturing practices that were written about. Lean construction started looking at lean manufacturing practice and came out of those observations, and how do we adapt that? And then more recently, design, because it is a product development type environment, we're just making one product that is built once, right? Hopefully, well, with some exceptions. But it is a product development environment. So we started looking at Agile and Scrum, which looked at that same source material and started thinking about how does this apply to us. So there are some overlaps and some blending of tools and practices that bring Last Planner System together with what you do in Scrum. And so we will look at which of the tools are applied at which levels and how. But one of the things I wanted to talk about before we jump into the mechanics is one of the things we borrow from Scrum is the idea of a sprint time box. And essentially, kind of like our iterative plan, do, check, act continuous improvement process that comes right out of Lean and that we apply to Lean construction. In Last Planner System for construction, we apply that on an iterative basis by looking at weekly work plans. And we have retrospectives on how reliable those weekly work plans are going. And what we're looking at in Design Last Planner System is absolutely we're going to be looking at a plan, do, check, act to see how our planning mechanism is going. But we're also going to introduce the idea of a sprint time box, which pulls in some other iterative behaviors. So we're going to blend the planning component, but also a product review component. And what it forces us to start doing is to merge the way we do retrospectives and continuously improve how we build our plans and how effectively we execute our plans for what we're going to get done and how effectively we are meeting those commitments. And it's going to increase the frequency at which our teams are actually putting eyeballs on the products that we are developing so that we can get a much more iterative feedback loop going. And we're not having to wait for these bigger deliverables that we are used to in tradition. So we will take a look at how this starts showing up, but keep this idea of a sprint time box in mind as we start going down and start looking at how each element of Last Planner System works together in the design world. So we will talk about how the whole team interacts with Last Planner System for collaborative plan development, commitment management, managing handoffs and constraints, and then how the idea of the time box and this idea of a sprint also starts to talk to how we probably want to organize our teams into cluster groups or smaller sub-teams that are leveraging both tools as we're going along. Okay, so getting into what do the elements of Last Planner System look like. So if you have participated in the past in Last Planner System training or you've read about it, you're probably familiar with the idea of 5 connected conversations. And this goes to show you that as long as you do this, you can always learn something. Because over the years, what I've learned is that the 5 connected conversations can show up in many different ways. So we talk about this as a practice and a set of methods that are applied so that these conversations are happening with your project team. But the tools can change from project to project, right? As long as we are sticking to the fundamentals and we are actually doing these things and having these conversations. The way it shows up can be adapted to each team, and should be. No two teams are alike, and each team kind of needs to adjust things, especially if they're going to be working together for a long time, to determine what works best and then continuously improve that process like everything else. But to be successful in implementing Last Planner system, this is the traditional construction Last Planner stack where we are having our should conversations. What should we be doing when in our milestone planning? And then at a deeper level in our phase pull planning, where we start getting into what are the handoffs, what is the sequence and flow of work we need to accomplish in order to achieve this particular milestone. These are should conversations. We're not in the commitment making phase of things yet. Those inform our look ahead planning, which happens on an iterative basis. So we are always looking 6 weeks or so down the road of the schedules that we have built based on our pull plans. And this is our can conversation. What is standing in our way that would prevent us from executing this plan? And then we take that down to the next level of detail where we, in a construction framework, we start talking about our weekly work plans, and we're actually making the commitments of this is going to happen next week on these days. This is how I know I'm done. And we've had the can conversations, so we have successfully removed all the constraints, and we connect all of that with our learning improvement cycle, which happens at each iteration of this work, so that every week is an opportunity to learn and improve our reliability and how we're working together. One of the nuanced differences that is affected by Scrum and this idea of sprint time boxing is that we start adjusting our look ahead frequency, and we start looking at bringing in this idea of a flexible, to an extent, design work cycle. So traditional construction Last Planner system is pretty specific for the most part about the timing of these things in terms of 6-week look ahead, weekly work plan. In design Last Planner system, we talk about each team should look at what is a reasonable design work cycle, which is going to govern the frequency at which we are getting together in person, or currently virtually, obviously, to advance the state of our plan, build our commitments, and really look at an intensity of activities that come next and what those commitments are. And those are going to be different for every project, and those need to scale with the project. So we'll get into how you approach that and how we do that as we get to it. There are still weekly components to the planning, but those are also slightly different. So this is where the key differences start to show up in terms of the conversations, but the nature of what we're talking about in terms of should, these are things we can do, and then tracking those commitments on a weekly basis and building that learning and improvement into each conversation is still important. So let's start stepping through these, each element at a time. We'll start, and my favorite topic, I think, I like them all, but I think I've developed a special affinity towards milestone planning, frankly, because it's one of the places we struggle. We really struggle, in my opinion, to get effective milestone plans visually created that everybody buys into and that has meaning for the structure of the work. And so I think it is actually the most important conversation we should be having early to start building the right sort of alignment and the right sort of tempo for the team. So one of the things we talk about is what is a milestone, all right? In a traditional sense, we're used to the design deliverable milestones. All right, we're going to go through our SD phase, and then we're going to transition to our DD phase, and then we've got a 50% DD set deliverable, and so forth and so on. But what actually matters, right? In a lean Last Planner context, what matters is releasing work, and releasing work in a sound way that we know is anchored in the right information and the right decisions, so that we avoid carrying incorrect assumptions forward, which is going to expose us to the possibility of rework. So one of the things we try to work on really hard, and just as an aside, I'm going to talk a lot about blowing things up like the traditional design milestone packages and things like that. And I absolutely understand we are all working in many different forms of contracts, and often those are absolutely required, and we work in that framework where no matter what, our client is still expecting us to deliver that set of documents, and there's a certain definition for that set of documents. So I think even in that context, right, we can still work very hard as a team to say, here's the deliverable, and we know it's out there on this date, But let's take that and break that deliverable down into a solid flow of information and decisions that we can roadmap so that when we get to that deliverable, we've had these conversations, we've engaged the owners in incremental decision making along the way. So we have a high level of certainty when we get there that we're producing this, but there aren't going to be any surprises. So all of these things need to be adapted and scaled to the particular type of contract environment you're in, but we can apply the fundamentals even within the constraints that we often face in the real world. So I just wanted to get that out there because I'm sure a lot of people are thinking, well, that sounds great, but I know I have this thing due. So if we can take that approach and start breaking down one of the core milestones, especially early in the project, are how do we support the owner in decision making to answer the questions that we have in a sound way so that we can release those decisions and then advance those decisions into a more detailed production design. That kind of mentality hopefully prevents us from overproducing content and detail and then having to change it, or worst come to worst, not being able to change it and carrying things forward, right, that people are unhappy with down the road. And so what do we need to make those decisions, and how do we need to engage the owner into making those decisions? So we start to look at redefining these things, where in a traditional framework, right, we've got these schematic design development, CDs, we've got incremental steps of percentage based along the way. And my favorite teaser question always is, great, you're going to have a 50% DD mechanical set. Are you drawing 50% of the ducts, or are you drawing 100% of the ducts 50%, or what are we actually looking at, right? We say we are all on the same page as what these things mean, and we, even when we're working off of checklists, we have a sense of certainty that everybody's working off the same checklist, and we all know what it means, and yet it never fails that we find that we're not aligned, and when that end product comes out, there's issues. So the more we can target our early milestone planning at really defining what the handoffs of information are, what are the decisions, what is the content that is truly meaningful to be released, and that releases other people to do certain parts of the work, whether it's an owner making a decision, whether it's getting financial certainty, whether it's developing a visual mock-up of an element that we need to see, right? And the more we can talk about what do we need to do to release other people to do the work and to advance the state of the work that we need to do, the more we can start structuring these milestones to really support that when we hit print on that document set, we have a higher level of certainty. And so that gets us into this conversation about how do we small batch design. This is something we talk about all the time in construction. And so how do we small batch design? How do we break that deliverable set of thinking? How do we bring cost and benefit into the analysis when you get deeper into integrated project delivery and target value design, right? That is where those things really start getting anchored. But even owners that aren't in IPD and TVD, there is a benefit from feeding those things through. I was just working on a project team where we were struggling with this, and there was a discussion about vertical panels on the exterior building except for the horizontal, and there was adamant discussion about, no, I want it vertical because it's my building and that's great. And then we actually were able to bring cost into the conversation and realize it was a $4 million higher cost. And then the decision changed. It's like, well, it's not worth that much, right? And so we need to talk about how do we make sound decisions? How do we bring in some of the other lean tools and build those into how do we achieve these milestones? So things like doing a choosing by advantages or a cost benefit analysis or an A3, if we're working in that lean development, in that lean design framework, suddenly become things that we need to add to our milestone plan, right? And these are the things we're leading to decision points. So the other element of that is one of the things that we always struggle with is let construction pull design. And again, I know that's not always possible because we're not always working in a framework where we have construction engaged while we're designing. But if we do, or if we have a proxy for construction engaged during design, a consultant or somebody that can speak to procurement timelines and things like that, let's bring that into our milestone conversation and start talking about this whole project with the end in mind initially. And how long is it going to take to build things? How long is it going to take to buy things? And start layering that into our small batch framework. So what we want to avoid with this is hopefully the picture is coming across and you can see the little kitty cat furiously pounding on the keyboard. This is what I imagine all of my designer friends look like And especially in the days when I was an owner and I got the email response or the phone response of, sorry, we've got this deliverable due in 3 weeks. I can't do any phone conferences. I can't do any meetings. We've just got to be heads down for 3 weeks because we've got to focus on this deliverable. Once we get it pushed out the door, then we can talk again. That's what I imagine them looking like. And if that is the format we get stuck in, that when these deliverables are approaching us, kind of like when a construction milestone approaches us and we can't move it and we have to shove all these people into the project and all this overtime, what happens, right? We introduce errors, we introduce surprises, quality suffers, we probably end up with more rework because of those errors and surprises, and we have a bigger chance of coming back with something that's over budget because we didn't get to vet it through our cost people, right? And all that results in more stress. So the more we can streamline our milestone plans and get this early and create this dynamic document as we're moving through this, the more we can start to flatten the curve of what we need to do. Use the COVID-19 reference, nice. That tells you where my mind's been. The more we can level the work resources of what we need to do and avoid these big crashes at milestone deliverable stages so that we're not getting stuck in this. So as we start to develop these milestones, right, in a traditional sense, when we're all meeting together, we start to pull these things. They may be very simple frameworks on a wall where we are putting milestones for questions, milestones for permitting, and they may look a lot like a construction milestone pull plan where we say, in order to get to this permit package or in order to get to answering the question about what does a typical room look like, right? Let's break down sort of what our duration timing is for developing these things. I like to start with a framework that looks like what you see on the picture here, where we are rapidly developing this on a whiteboard, on a piece of paper, just with sticky notes. They can often be stream of consciousness. Let's pick the designer's and the owner's brain and start getting all the decisions up there, right? And then start to create the pull structure of prioritization of what do we think needs to come first and second, and then let's start talking about timing and duration of these milestones. And I usually prefer to do it in this kind of format where you see, right, there's some swim laning about different disciplines or different areas of the building, but we start creating, similar to in construction, this context of milestone, phase of work that we need to accomplish, and decisions we need to make. And then as we get more developed with these, we can create more of a linear flow of these things into a chart that maybe has a time scale to it. So the importance of doing this early and the importance of doing this frequently is anchoring our pull planning activities. So another key difference I see, right, if you're familiar with the construction phase pull planning, we'll grab a major milestone like building structure sufficiently ready to release skin or sufficiently ready to release to start roughing in. We get all the trades together and we do this big pull planning event to start figuring out the entire sequence and duration of activities that allow us to release that milestone. In design, we still apply pull. So when we identify a question, when we identify even a hot topic that comes up or an issue that gets raised in a design meeting. So we might walk into a meeting and say, hey, I've got a new issue. We need to resolve this. We can apply pull to get a small team together, the stakeholders that have input into resolving that question, that hot topic, or a more major deliverable like we need to get a permit set put together. And similar to in construction, we still start with the end in mind. We put that, here is the objective milestone of getting to this thing. And we can build our network of activities and our network of promises and requests working backwards from that element. So we say, if we need to answer this question, what are the things we need to do and what do I need from somebody else in order to get there? And we can rapidly develop that in a pull format, keeping in mind and introducing at this stage that we are starting to bring in the idea of not project level, but this is transaction level conditions of satisfaction, where if I have a request from somebody or I am the performer of somebody, you may have seen this if you've studied lean at all, but or even in non-lean circles, this is pretty well known. But when we are having these collaborative conversations about how do we achieve this and how do we build this network of commitments or this network of promises and requests to let us deliver on this milestone we need to achieve, in this, there is an element of negotiating what I need from somebody and what I can provide to somebody in a time frame that is reasonable. And this act of negotiation and acceptance is another opportunity to start small batching our deliverables. and our exchanges, because we can start talking about what do you really need to get going on what you need to get going. A lot of times, especially early on when teams are forming, we'll get a mechanical person that says, well, I just give me the entire floor plan for everything and then I can start. And the reality is oftentimes we can break those things down quite a bit more into smaller batches of information exchanges and handoffs. And so the mechanism for this in Pull is similar. If we're working together in a real or a virtual environment, we try to use color coding. We use sticky notes that say, here's what I'm going to do. Here's what I need. We try to small batch this. I put my name on it. We use color coding to usually denote either the discipline or the work cluster from which this commitment is coming. One of the differences in design pull planning to last planner, or the construction pull planning, is where in construction, when we do a pull plan, we specifically focus on sequence and duration. So we will do an entire pull plan without putting any dates to it. In design, we will typically start with dates from the beginning. And the reason for that is, for most people engaged in the design phases of a project, our duration for how quickly we can get something to somebody is much more dependent on when I'm working on it, because we're typically load leveling other projects, other constraints that are not specific to this thing or these people that I'm working on this project. And so if you ask me for something next week on Thursday, it might only, I might be able to start working on it Tuesday morning and get it to you on time. But the following week I'm buried, or the following week I'm on vacation, right? So the when is important in design, much more so to when I have a construction team that is typically much more full-time and we're loading those resources up. And so along with that, many times in Pull, on the design side, even though we may break out and do a network map of a pull plan, a mini pull plan to solve a specific problem, to solve a specific small milestone, we will typically add all of these things in design to our pull planning boards, which are these rotating look-ahead plans, which may go much more than 6 weeks. But we will iteratively add incremental information to these things as we do little micro pull plans on a lot more milestones. So if you look at this example, right, there are a lot of small milestones on this board, and that's very common to what we see. We still try to separate things into swim lanes. When we load these things up into the dates on these pull planning boards, right, we still observe the practice of let's go off and network map it first and then contribute to the pull plan. So, similar to construction, this will look similar, that we try to start with the objective in mind, so the end milestone, and then we work our way backwards in this network of, here's what I need to do, here's what I need from you. Okay, I can do this on this date, so here's what I need from somebody else, and we work through that. The fundamentals that we need to keep in mind as we're having these conversations and we're negotiating is small batch the handoff, do this frequently, build this level of pull into all of your planning engagements, apply this to decision points, deliverables, permitting, right? Anything that we can identify as a milestone in design that releases something, we can go off and do a mini pull plan on it and then add it to our pull planning board. And we start to incrementally increase the amount of information we have. So the latest development in this for all of us is that we've been having to adapt to virtual in a very rapid learning and sudden way. And so the good news is we've worked with many teams that have actually been able to do this quite effectively. We lose, obviously, the face time and the face-to-face conversations, which are so invaluable in what we do. But through video conferencing and more frequent interactions, we have been able to engage virtually. And the good news is, right, some projects, larger projects, are able to buy into some of the last planner specific tools that are out there that are available. You can find out about those from the Lean Construction website. But we've also seen a lot of creativity in using free or cheap online tools that are available to most of us. So we've had teams that have created Excel and PDF mock-ups of kind of pull planning walls that are very easy to use in design. And then if you do something like you have a PDF version of it with some templates for sticky notes, you can do that in a Bluebeam studio session where people can actually interactively move things while you're on a video conference call. We've had other teams engage with things like Mural, which is a really neat lightweight tool, and it's generally free or cheap. So there are options out there as we're working virtually, which is likely to continue for a while, that we can keep the same conversations going and not lose the spirit of what we're doing. We just need to work on the mechanics and the way we're capturing the information. So as we continue down the stack, right, we've been having both in the milestone planning and these phase pull planning conversations, where the phases that we're talking about in these design iterations could be much smaller, and we have a lot more of these milestones that we're doing pull plans on. But we're still having should conversations, even though we're landing things on dates. We are adding things incrementally to our pull plan, which looks like this look ahead board. So one of the transitions now is that this all works in conjunction in what we are calling in the design last planner system, the design cycle planning. And this is dependent on the frequency that we decide for the team. So dependent on the scale of the project, the distribution of my team, which is less important now that we're all virtual, frankly, anyway, but the availability of my team and often the speed at which we are creating information should spark a conversation about what is the right scale of my design work cycle. And from my experience, it's not less than 1 week. It's probably not more than 4 weeks. A lot of teams fall in the 2 to 3 week framework. Some do 4 if things are at a comfortable pace. And some teams on large, fast-paced projects, especially IPD projects where there's a lot of things and a lot of decisions being made on an ongoing basis, are doing this weekly. And so this should actually be part of the formative piece of the project team. We're going to implement last planner system design. This is sort of we've done the milestone planning. We kind of understand the pace at which we're going. We have some initial understanding of the speed at which we have to make decisions to feed into all of these milestones that we're going to hit. So based on that, we can start saying, okay, we think for our purposes, a 3-week design cycle is going to be adequate. That is also going to coincide with this idea of the sprint time box that we talked about earlier. So part of that is on these 3-week design cycles is a meeting to at least go through the pull planning update, identifying new information, new milestones that we need to pull plan, and reflecting on the previous design cycle. So where in a construction last planner system, right, it's a little bit more structured because every milestone and a milestone might be a 8 to 12 week duration, right? And we do a pull plan for that, and then we do another pull planning session for the next milestone phase in 6 weeks or something. And in between that, we're doing weekly work plans and advancing the look ahead plan. In a design world, my frequency of getting together for these planning sessions might only be every 2 to 3 weeks. If we're working on a lean project that's doing big rooms, this should be coinciding with our big room event, and the planning should form part of my big room agenda. And so what we talk about is the idea of scrum. Scrum, for those of you familiar, is a rugby term, right? And it is the act of the rugby players getting together in an interlocked fashion, advancing the ball, and basically claiming ground and moving the ball forward. And so that's kind of what we think about when we apply this to our design cycles, is we are incrementally building this plan as we are moving out in these cycles, right? And we may have a planning board that goes out much further, but the level of detail much further out is much less. We may only have parked milestones and a handful of things we know we need to do, but we start to fill in the detail and the gaps as we get closer to the work happening. And part of that is because, like we say, design is emergent, right? That detail of activities 2 months down the road, 3 months down the road may change dramatically based on a decision we make next week. So it is an opportunity to prevent us from having to do a whole bunch of planning rework and getting stuck in a structure that's no longer true once we've gotten through these initial stages. So this is important to work in the flow of the project team meetings, to coincide with our big room planning sessions as we're getting together, and we're incrementally adding these things to our agendas at every design cycle. Early in the project, we may be updating our milestone plan because as we learn more, that's a dynamic living document, right? And as we learn more, We may add milestones. We may change our durations on milestones because we've discovered more. Each of these design cycle meetings or big room meetings will have new hot topics, new issues that are being brought in, and clarity on decisions that need to be made in the next design cycle to support our milestones. So these will all form the basis of some mini pull plans that we're doing. And then in the end of that meeting, we're bringing all of these things back to our planning board, and we're advancing the plan in these design work cycles at the frequency that we have decided for our team. So the discipline about the frequency and sticking to that is very important. Now, the team can make adjustments to it, but it should be an aligned discussion, not just because somebody's not available or we've got to move it this week, right? We should have a conversation about, hey, we've got a higher level of intensity coming up over the next couple of months. We think we're going to be making a lot more decisions and doing a lot more work. So I think we should change our frequency from 3 weeks to 2 weeks, because we're going to be churning through a lot more information. And then we build alignment around the team, and then we change our practices to support that. So one of the other elements that comes into that design cycle planning in this framework is that every design cycle should have a retrospective component. So in the sprint planning world that comes from Scrum, every sprint we complete, which we call a design work cycle, is an opportunity to collect the feedback of how did our planning execution actually go. Just like we do in construction, right? This is an opportunity to harvest the team. Where are we tripping up? Where are we getting hung up? What's slowing us down? Where did we miss commitments? Why? Where are we having a hard time actually sticking to the decisions that we had anticipated making? This is the continuous improvement conversation. And these should be short but facilitated components of that work cycle planning agenda. The other part of that, if we miss this, right, this is important, because if we miss this, just like in construction last planner, if we go through the mechanics of doing construction last planner, putting stickies on the wall and having our weekly planning meetings and doing weekly work plans, but we don't have the retrospective conversation about what didn't go to plan and why, and how can we make it better next week, then we cannot expect the continuous improvement engine to kick into gear and help us improve the way we work together over the project. So it is important to build this as a distinct and practiced part of the design cycle meetings, and to pick facilitators that are good at running through retrospectives. There should be some component there, and do this every time and be practiced about it. And so it's an opportunity to focus on how is our planning going and how is our plan execution going. But like I talked about at the beginning, it is also an opportunity to do a show and tell of here's what we've actually produced. So this is a little bit of a report out, a more lengthy report out of here's the stuff we created since the last time we were together that we had committed to completing. Because one of the things we talk about in these design work cycles, we should be tough about what is the expected outcome of that card I'm putting on the board, right? When I say this is going to be done, I need to be able to define what done for this element looks like. So it might be, for this typical room, I will have an RCP for everybody to look at. And that RCP is going to be done. It's not going to be a draft. It's not going to be whatever, but it is my version of done for the RCP, and I'm going to issue that. But it's only going to be for this one room. I'm not doing these other rooms yet, right? So we should be talking about that, and we should be seeking feedback. This is where the continuous improvement input on the product from the owner comes into play, and where we need to negotiate the owner participation, because we have an opportunity to get eyeballs on products being developed every 2 to 3 weeks, maybe 4 weeks, right? Whatever our design work cycle frequency is as we're moving through this. There is a huge value to actually getting feedback, even if it's not from all the stakeholders. It might just be the owner's representative, but we can see what's being created and provide feedback and guidance on changes that we need to make, things that aren't going as expected, and we can make small incremental improvements. And so the feedback on that product might well change the work we're doing in our next design work cycle, right? So that's why we have to follow this level of increment. So that builds into our next level of detail is, or our next conversation is, how does this relate to weekly planning in a design cycle, right? In a design world. So in construction, we do our look ahead planning in the same weekly meeting as we advance our look ahead plan and we talk about constraints. We create the weekly work plan for next week. We do a retrospective on the weekly work plan from last week. We do our continuous improvement. Everybody aligns on, this is the committed plan for next week. If we are only meeting every 2 to 3 weeks in a design, and we only have the opportunity to create the design plan in our design cycle meetings, so every 2 to 3 weeks, we are actually creating more of a plan than just a weekly work plan. So we may be creating 2 to 3 weeks worth of commitments, but we still want to maintain the weekly habit of managing that plan and managing the will conversation of that commitment. So at a minimum weekly, when we pull our design cycle plan elements and the sticky notes or the virtual sticky notes, and we typically pull those into some kind of document or online tool that lets us manage those commitments remotely. Now we're doing everything remotely, but we pull those typically what's called a commitment log or a work register, right? And this just gives us a better way or a natural way. Some teams do this right off of the PDF that they've created off of their design work cycle plan. But we need some way to make this transportable and to have it open in front of us as we're doing the work and as we're doing our check-in. So the commitment log is a component of, here are the commitments I'm tracking, here's the current status, here's the person that has committed to this. But it's also a place to inline, if we're just doing a spreadsheet, it's also a place to list and identify constraints. Now, we don't want to just write these things down and hope something will magically happen to it. We do have alternatives. So I've had decent luck in utilizing software, Excel. Some teams love apps, some teams love Asana, some teams love Trello, right? There is an infinite number of apps out there that let you create your own version of a work register or commitment log, because it's essentially a list of tasks. And you can do that in just about any collaborative task management tool. But the important part is that we're not just listing constraints and listing commitments. This becomes an interactive part of how we advance the plan. So there is one final level of detail on a weekly basis that may show up in your team. So if we are advancing the plan in these work cycles, and we're advancing this plan in these conversations of commitment, right? What will likely happen is, depending on the type of project format that you're working in, the different colored stickies on our work cycle plan, which represent commitments, are either going to be by discipline. So it could be, an architectural and interiors, a civil engineer. And in many project teams, especially larger, it is probably made by the lead for that discipline, right? Whoever is the planning lead for that discipline. Some of them will be owners. You'll have CM and trades in there if we're more integrated. If we're in an integrated format, we may also be treating these colors as work clusters. So if we're working in an integrated project format and we're actually all working together and we're breaking our team up, not just into disciplines, but into cross-disciplinary work clusters where we've got engineers and we've got owners reps and we've got trades and cost folks all sitting on the same work cluster team, we may be making commitments across work clusters. And that's typically what's represented by the colors of our commitments on our planning wall in these work cycles. One additional element that we start to pull in from Lean, and it's part of Scrum as well, is the idea of basically a Scrum board or a sprint board. These are also very simple Kanban boards, if you're familiar with that. But one of the extra steps that we take, if we're doing our work cycle planning sessions, the planning leads for the disciplines or the work clusters get together, and we're making these commitments based on what we need from each other to advance the milestones. 3 of these commitments on the big board may end up turning into a dozen or more activities for my work cluster or my discipline. So there is one extra level of small team planning where I can break this down into a simple Scrum board that says, all right, team, for the next week, we have these 3 commitments to meet. Let's take these 3 commitments, blow them up into all the activities we need to get done, put those in our weekly backlog, and we can manage those with a simple board that looks like backlog in progress and ready for review, right? And then we might be utilizing that to manage our team's work in that smaller breakout session on a more frequent basis. So that is one of the other elements that some teams have been successfully leveraging. And you can do this just even in your own company. So if your company represents one discipline, and you get no other opportunity to engage in a lean project, right? And your team is not doing work cycle planning or pull plans or anything. You just get issued a list of things that you need to get done. You can still pull your own team together, do a mini pull plan, blow that up into some scrum boards for your different team members and say, these are all the things you need to be working on. And you've just created a really effective visual management tool that lets you really track the commitments and turn those commitments into specific activities in a very lightweight and agile framework. So some teams make more complicated scrum boards. These tend to morph depending on the requirements and what we want, but they can be as simple as, this is my current backlog, this is what I'm working on right now, and this is what I've completed that's ready to turn over. And I've even seen this with some construction companies out there on project sites, which is really cool. So I've actually visited some construction sites where the deployment for the project managers and the engineers and the superintendents that are on site have personal scrum boards like this where they're managing their individual work, and they use this in their daily stand-up. And so these are how we try to blend the different elements of Last Planner System and Scrum. And the learning's not done yet. So remember I talked about the weekly planning, right, and the weekly planning session. So the other element of this is, as we complete our work cycle plans, we create these list of commitments, we add them to our commitment log or our work register. We want to, at a minimum, have a weekly, so if we're on a 2-week work cycle sequence cadence, if we're on a 3-week work cycle cadence, whatever that is, we never want to let things that go that long before we touch base on it. So at a minimum on a weekly basis, often more frequently, 2 to 3 times a week if there's a lot of work going on, we want to have commitment check-ins that are essentially rapid fire, high energy stand-up where each lead, discipline lead, work cluster lead, whoever has their name associated with commitments on our board and our commitment log work register, has the opportunity to do a rapid fire report out. And what we're looking for is, right, what am I on track for getting done? What have I gotten done? Right, so these things are all things that my team's been working on, and it was completed per the plan. We're not having any issues. These are things we're currently working on in progress that we are not constrained on. Most importantly, what are my constraints, right? This is actually the important part of this conversation. If things are on track, if things are getting done as promised, wonderful. We can talk about that very quickly and move on. What we want to share with the team and what we want to hear about is, these are things that I have on the commitment log with my team that they're currently constrained on or are at risk of being constrained on very shortly, because we feel like this piece that we need in order to do our work is not going to come on time. And that is a call to action for our team, right? If your team has a facilitator, if your team is working in another thing we borrow from the Agile Scrum world, a lot of Lean Last Planner facilitators that are doing design stuff are also what is called Scrum Master Certified. If you have people like that supporting your project, or if you just have internal project leads who are also acting as the facilitator for your team, when you hear of constraints, that is your time to jump into action and say, I will take that on, I'll chase it to ground, I will do what needs to be done so that this does not be an impact for you, or at least find out the information of it is an external constraint or there is some immovable object in the way that is going to prevent us from releasing that constraint on time. So we need to have a breakout session in order to replan this, right? So we're mining for constraints at these weekly check-in sessions. And am I overall on track? Now, the importance of these check-in sessions, these should be super fast. For a lot of project teams, these are not lengthy report outs unless you are on a weekly work cycle cadence and you are actually combining these with product report outs where you're talking about, this is what we've gotten done, this is what it looks like. Then it might be a longer report out. If your work cycle is 2 weeks, 3 weeks, and these are just planning check-ins of how are we doing against our commitments, these should probably be 15 to 20 minutes at best. And one of the ways you can tell if this is successful or not is listen to, if you're doing this on a phone call, if you're doing this in person, what is the format that is going on. So one of the ways you can tell this is going wrong is if you have to have one person who's facilitating the check-in, and that person pulls up the commitment log or work register and goes line by line and says, all right, item 1, somebody was supposed to dig up options on a light fixture submittal. Bob, that's for you. Bob, where are we at with that thing? And Bob gives a 30-second answer about what he hasn't got yet from the vendor or how he sent something to the owner and is waiting for a reply. Okay, let's move on to item 2. If that is the context of your check-ins, you're doing it wrong. Sorry to be so blunt, but the way you want these, and I'm being blunt, but I've also lived through it, and it is a struggle, right? So I'm saying that a little bit facetiously, maybe, that's hard to say. But that happens to a lot of teams. And when you see that it's happening that way, what it tells you is you have low engagement and low ownership. And as lean professionals and lean facilitators, we want to drive things towards high engagement and high ownership. So if I'm Bob and I have 4 commitments on the work cycle for this week, then I should be eager and ready to come to that report out, and I don't wait to get called on. That check-in is almost a self-facilitating thing, because we can make a team agreement just to say, let's sort alphabetically by name of performer, and that is our report out session. So I know if I'm Bob and there's not an Alfred or an Amy on the team, hey, I'm first in line. So as soon as we start, hey, this is Bob, I'm ready. So I've got 4 items on the commitment log for this work cycle. We finished our first one that was due yesterday, no problems. 2 of them are on track, no problems. I have an issue potentially with number 4, and I'd like to see if I can stay on after the check-in call with John and Rick and see if we can have a quick sidebar. We can let everybody else drop off, and I'm done. Next. That is a high energy report out check-in session. You're just farming for commitments and what is wrong. You're not negotiating. You're not regurgitating everything. And if there's a facilitator on the call, they may chime in real quick and ask, hey, so on your sidebar, do you want me to join just to help if there's any constraints? Yay or nay? And boom, we move on to the next person. It is highly helpful to do these standing up. If you feel like standing up is still too long and not high energy enough, then make people plank. Turn on cameras, require cameras to be turned on, and make people plank while they're doing their report out. Just anything you got to do to keep these things high energy and keep them moving. So all of this is feeding into how do we build the learning and improving plan, do, check, act in this sprint time box work cycle framework that we're doing for, right? So the other element is the weekly check-in session. Forgot to mention this, the weekly check-in session, that is reporting out on the work cycle commitment log. So these are the team members that are participating in those planning sessions that have items on the commitment log. We may supplement that in my small team, whether it's my work cluster or my own just company team. If we are doing those sprint boards where we blow up our commitments into a list of activities we need to do, then those are really well supplemented with daily huddles and daily stand-ups, where we may have a 5-minute coffee stand-up every morning to say, right, team, where are we at? Who's working on what? Need any help? Perfect, let's get back to work, right? So those are the 2 elements where we check in, we report out, we make visible what is not working. And then in these work cycle planning sessions, we are also managing individually within our disciplines, but definitely we try to do this as a team. And I say we try because this is a lot less scientific so far from what I've seen in design and construction. I believe there is still value in tracking the data, but we have yet to make this information quite as useful. But just like we do in construction, that 54% number we reflected on at the beginning of the presentation, right? If we want to have a feedback tool that shows us how my team is forming and progressing and evolving over time as we are having conversations on these work cycle retrospectives of how can we work better together, how can we have less miscommitments, what do we need to fix to help our team advance the ball more efficiently and to get more done and to be more reliable and to make better decisions and to help the owner make better decisions, right? If we are having those retrospectives and conversations and we are acting upon them to change the way we work together, then we should see, if we are tracking the data, to see that in the trend line. So the simple way of tracking a reliability index is week after week, using our commitment log that we're pulling down, how many of the things that we are committing are actually landing as committed? How many of them are moving to the right? So it's a simple percentage, right? Like the 54% number that we looked at. And as my team progresses, right, are we 50%? Are we lower? This is an optimistic graph that I'm using for an example. This team is near perfect, which does probably not exist. But it gives us trend lines and it gives us feedback. So there is a time investment, a little bit. It should not actually be a big time investment, but there's a little bit of time investment that if I'm the facilitator and I'm listening in on the check-in calls and then I'm conducting the work cycle retrospective, where I run back through that commitment log and actually count how many things did we have, how many things did we do as planned, how many things did we have to change the date on and renegotiate, that I create these visuals that give us some feedback on team performance. So there is a payback to that investment only if we are, as a team, practicing a conversation about reasons for variance. So why did the tasks that we couldn't get done on time or as promised not get done that way, right? And that should drive our continuous improvement conversations. And we can start tracking some standard reasons for variance like we do in construction. They're a little bit different. I was over-communicated. I didn't understand. We miscommunicated. It's so common. I didn't get the thing that I needed to help actually get my work done. There was a change. We just decided to call an audible and change the plan. Other constraint, right? So there are different variances, but we should be building into our retrospective cycle. The other thing that I believe is huge in the design world, and I've challenged some of the teams I work with to start trending this data. I don't have real data yet, so this is made up. But I firmly believe that if we were able to track percent tasks unanticipated, this would be a big number and a big impact on the chaos of most of our work weeks. So what happens is we do a work cycle planning meeting, we do our commitments, we make a plan. The next day rolls around and I get an email from somebody else on the team that suddenly asks for like 3 more things. And I would say, why didn't we know this yesterday? And so even if we're not tracking percent tasks unanticipated, we should be bringing our anecdotal experience of this to our work cycle retrospective. Say, all right, team, we're doing these planning sessions, we're creating a plan, we're making commitments. Every week, I get a bunch of emails that's asking for stuff that wasn't on the plan. How do we fix this? Because the more you can fix that, and I'm convinced everybody's suffering through this, the more you can fix that, the more it helps you streamline the work that you're actually doing, and the less you have to multitask and the less you have to change direction. And as you read most any management book, we know that, the less you have to change tasks and direction, the more you are able to get done in a given week. So that brings us to the question and answer phase. And I think I was able to allow an extra 3 minutes from what I normally do.
Fantastic.
I do want to open it up now for any questions based on the last planner system for design that we have just reviewed. And then we'll have a couple of quick closing slides and we'll let everybody go about their weekend.
Fantastic. So we have some comments and questions here. I also want to remind everybody now is a great time for what we call a plus delta for your feedback. Pluses are things you liked about the presentation, you enjoyed about it. Deltas are kind of like wishes. You wish you would have talked about it. You wish you would have gone into more detail on. Put those into the questions box as well. Again, Christian
Perfect.
mentioned continuous improvement. We'd love to have that from you so we can improve our presentation. So
and I promise you we do that year after year. That actually does happen.
It does, absolutely. Delays in design are not allowed as a result of bad planning, but rather a lack of decision-making by active involvement from ownership is the comment. The question is, how can ownership be held accountable to the last planner system in design?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. So as those of us that have sat in the owner's seat and have gone down the road of becoming lean practitioners, you will often hear us say, the owner is one of the biggest problems in project delivery. And the accountability is built into the system in a way. Now, enforcing that accountability is another issue because what it actually requires of the owner is resourcing the project so that the owner is participating in all of these work cycle planning sessions. The owner is making commitments on that board like every other disciplined team member. And so the owner has a color, the owner is up on the board writing their name. Now, how we define the owner is another project-specific question, right? Because many times you'll have an owner project manager and owner rep, and they're acting as a proxy for a lot of stakeholders. So one of the continuous improvements, so at least we make the commitments visible. The person in the room then has the challenge of running around that owner's organization and drawing the information they need in and drawing in the stakeholders to actually answer that question and make those decisions and bring that to bear. We will stumble on that, especially early. So bringing that in the retrospective and saying, we've missed these commitments and here's the root cause. We could not get aligned on owner decision making. And here's why. How do we get better? A lot of times the aha light bulb when it goes off is, I need more stakeholders participating and I need to get closer to where the work is happening. These are all lean principles. And when you can get the owner engaged in that and they see how much more effective it makes the team, it becomes a self-fulfilling and a self-sustaining thing, because the owner suddenly realizes they're getting a better product and their review and feedback loops are going to be short. So I think that is part of what is built in there, but we have to make that part of the conversation. And we also have to empower the owner with the right information. So the other part of that is, I like to focus the team, if we are successful in identifying what questions we need the owner to answer, let's dedicate the team's resources in doing the right level of analysis to support the team in the owner in making that decision soundly, right? So let's go out and do the research. Let's utilize choosing by advantages. Let's say, based on what we think we know as you as an owner and organization, here are the 3 or 4 different options we've looked at for this thing. Here's how we've analyzed it based on the CBA factors. CBA is another class. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail on that. But we have now done the legwork to present you with what we think is the right analytical knowledge to maybe make decision-making better, easier for you. And structuring some of the team's effort in that way to be an ally in the owner's decision-making, not just saying, do you want this or do you want that, right? And that helps the owner actually make better decisions more soundly.
Fantastic. Our next question is, what are some good resources to follow up and read and study on Last Planner and Scrum for Design?
Well, there are more resources out there I will say there are several books out there on Scrum. None of them are tailored to construction, but they're still good reads. So one of the books that actually got me first interested in Agile and Scrum is a very easy read and actually a very interesting and fun read called Scrum. I think it's called Doing Twice the Work in Half the Time. I would suggest that. It's a good segue to, there are books on the Lean Construction Institute website. Some of these are higher level, but they all talk about, there are some additional sections of information. So there are the Transforming Design and Construction book, the Don't Conform, Transform, both of which have sections in it that talk about Last Planner System. And the book that we put together a few years ago called Target Value Delivery has a chapter in it that blends Last Planner System and design with what we do in Target Value Delivery to an extent. To my knowledge, there has not yet been a book written specific to this content, but this presentation is going to be made available. And the website, the LCI website, also has additional e-learning. So there are some of those kinds of resources that are out there. Just to give another plug, there's also a whole bunch of lean coaches out there. So a lot of them are currently giving freely of their time because none of us can travel. So engage with your community of practice when they're doing lean coffee. Most of those are being supported by coaches. And you can come to those. They're virtual right now, but you can come to those and ask questions and dig further into some of the specific practices as well.
Wonderful. Our next question is defining handoffs equal to understanding the customer's conditions of satisfaction, making concrete owner values, that kind of thing?
It is, and it can be, and in the context of, especially as we start to get into target value delivery. So as the team becomes more deeply engaged in the owner's business case, and we start to manage our design process along the lines of a target value delivery approach, where we treat our understanding of owner's description of value as one of the factors by which we analyze design options and by which we present our analysis of design options. That needs to feed into how we create the pull mechanism of activities and information handoff that leads to the milestone of making a decision on something. Because absolutely, that is the basis by which the team's going to recommend and provide analysis on feeding into for owner decisions when we do that. So if we are starting this process in the early stages of a team that's forming, then going through a facilitated session of defining owner values, defining project conditions of satisfaction, aligning on those should all be part of the milestones that we're tracking as well. And those will have their own information handoffs and stakeholders we need to pull in, and absolutely that should be part of it.
Wonderful. I want to thank everyone for putting in all these great plus deltas. Go ahead and do that. We'd love to get this feedback from you.
Okay.
What are some suggested swim lanes if using color-coded notes for divisions?
So the swim lanes in design may change over time, as they do in construction. But you have seen on some of the examples on the board that we had lots of milestones distributed throughout our pull boards. So some teams do swim lanes by work cluster, and that work cluster is focusing on, right? We might have a work cluster that's focused on civil site architecture or civil structural architecture. An envelope, we might have a work cluster that's focused on the building dynamic systems. We might have a work cluster that's focused on the user interface pieces of the building, the interiors, the finishes, and all that kind of stuff, right? So that might lend itself to some swim laning. In certain phases of the project, you may also have permitting as a swim lane, procurement, right? So some of these things we started talking about. If we start pulling in from construction, that will lend itself well to a swim lane. And especially if you are in a contract type where you still have the traditional deliverable sets you need to build, you may layer on top of that a swim lane for my contract deliverables, right? So you may have your lean, interactive, collaborative swim lanes where you're carving out your information handoff milestones, your decisions, and those are more fluid. And then you may anchor that with, here's this deliverable, and these are all the decisions in progression. If we get all these milestones answered, then we know by the time we get to this milestone up here, we'll be in good shape. So those are some ideas. You can push and pull those as you develop the team. So they may change. Some teams have, they're working on different buildings. So they may have different boards for different buildings and things like that. So there's a number of different answers. What I generally try to avoid, both in design and construction, is doing a swim lane by discipline. Like, this is all the work for the architect, this is all the work for the civil engineer, this is all the work for the mechanical engineer. Because when you do that, you tend to lose the sense of flow and handoff that you get when you go from this colored sticky is leading to this colored sticky is leading to this colored sticky is leading to this milestone. So that would be my advice on that.
Our next question is, pull planning works best when face-to-face. During our current circumstances, have you experienced a successful virtual pull plan? And what tools did you use to achieve this success? Please pardon me.
Yes, you're absolutely right. It is more challenging when we're not face-to-face. The biggest benefit of a tool I can recommend is turn your cameras on. So even if you're sitting in your home office and you've got kids, dogs, spouses running in the background, everybody's going through the same thing. It doesn't matter. We get interrupted. It's okay. That's just the existence we're in right now. But turn on your cameras so you can see each other. I have had luck, and maybe that means using multiple screens if we need to make an investment in a second screen, so I can have all my cameras on my laptop, but then I can see the planning board on the other screen. We have to accommodate some of those things. So the teams that I have, what I have found is that we are tending to break one of the rules we try to observe more when we're in person, which each person owns and moves their own sticky. That becomes a little bit harder to do in this virtual environment. So what I have seen work for a lot of teams is there's somebody acting as a facilitator they're kind of running the pull board and other people are engaged visually and with cameras, providing feedback, driving the conversations, and you kind of have one record keeper, and then everybody aligns on, yes, this is our plan. Simple, lightweight tools, Excel. We've had teams adapt just Excel grid structures where they have their dates and stuff, and they've made simple text box templates where you can type stuff in and they drag them around. The example I showed with a PDF. So in Bluebeam, you can scratch out a PDF that looks like a pull board with dates and weeks and days and stuff, and pre-create text boxes where you can type in and you drag them around and make copies of them for the different colors. One tool that's been getting a lot of traction lately is called Mural, mural.co. I've only been using the free version for some small teams. I think there is some paid plan if you get more team members, but it essentially has a number of different frameworks. They even have some of these cool Scrum board frameworks that look like what we're looking at. They have frameworks for retrospective, and it's essentially just I can drop a sticky and I can type in it, I can move it around, and it's collaborative, so everybody can be logged in and looking at it at the same time. So those are some of the examples. Along with, if you're on a bigger, more complex team, there are the structured last planner tools that are out there. There's a number of those now, so I'm not going to run through a whole list of them, but I think most of them are LCI sponsors. So if you go to the LCI website, you can see what the technology sponsors are and look at those.
Okay, our next question is, what do you think about incentivizing high PPC?
I struggle with that. I struggle with that in the same way that I struggle using PPC as a scorecard. I've lived through projects where we say, hey, high-performing teams should get 75, 80% PPC. If we're below that, you're failing, or whatever. The problem with it is the numbers are so easy to cook just by how transparent we are of what we actually put on the board. So if it becomes an incentivized structure or a punitive structure, it's too easy for individuals to manipulate the commitments and be squishy with language and not be open. And it's like, yeah, it was done. It wasn't really done, but it was done. Or I put these commitments on there, but there's like 8 other things that I'm working on that I'm just not going to tell anybody about, and we'll just work that out behind the scenes. So to me, the most effective way is use PPC as a learning metric. Make it non-threatening. It's a feedback tool. It's meant to be a trending tool over time. Are the things we're actually investing in, the root cause conversations, the improvement conversations, are they resulting? And it's going to go up and down, right? 1 week might be high, 1 week might be low. So we got to look at the trend line. And it's a completely imperfect tool. And also look at it as a flag. I've walked into a project team where they were consistently reporting 85, 90% PPC. They would go through processing that and say, all right, good job, team. We did well. We're way above average at 54%. So it seemed like we did good. They put that away and then proceeded to spend the rest of the meeting complaining about everything on the constraint log and everything that's stuck and everything they can't get going. Obviously, their commitment log was not usefully implemented in all the work that they actually needed to be doing. And so I am more in the boat of use it as a learning tool, incentivize the behavior that you're looking for, not the number, and then see what feedback you can get out of it.
How does this tie into earned value, or does Last Planner replace value engineering?
So there's a couple of things going on there. One is in terms of earned value and utilizing basically schedule management and production completion from a schedule point of view in terms of earned value. And the other is value engineering, which has gotten a bad rep in the design world for construction because it's usually associated with a lot of rework, carving out scope that is painful and that ends up finding its way into the project later anyway. So part of that answer starts to transition into target value delivery and how we bring the soundness of decision making forward so that we don't get stuck in a reactive value engineering mode later. The earned value piece is more tied to, I think, the contract and the contract deliverables. So I think that would tie in with if we are obligated to those and if that's how we're doing billing, then we absolutely need to manage those, and maybe that becomes a swim lane to our pull plan, but we can still do the other swim lanes for the specific information handoff, small batching the questions that support the deliverable and the earned value schedule plan that we have to adhere to from a contract basis. So I think they can work hand in hand. Just like in construction, you can accomplish using a P6 CPM construction schedule and have it work hand in hand with last planner for construction.
Fantastic. So one last question, and I apologize. I know we have a ton more, but again, I will be sending all of these to Christian personally. And what we're probably going to end up doing is get a synopsis of everything, which I will send out to everybody because there are quite a few questions, Christian, and I'll get these over to you today. But in your last section about percent tracking, it seems like a change of the directions of the percent plan complete would be a way to track change orders. Do you consider that to be the case as well?
So if you're in an environment where in design you're tracking sort of scope of services change orders, then you absolutely could layer that in. And yes, I do believe that a team that's practicing last planner for design and a certain level of integration should have less change orders, especially less non-owner programmatic change order, right? The owner can always come along and say, I want some more stuff, and that results in a change order. But if we're talking about sort of design quality change orders, or we didn't draw that right and it's already been bid change orders, then yes, I think they should be related. Because not just the PPC number itself, but if we're doing last planner effectively, if we're doing work cycles, if we're having this cadence-based retrospective, it should relate to the quality of decision-making and the quality of documentation, which from a design document quality point of view should result in a higher level of quality and therefore less change orders. So I think that's what the question was, and if that is correct, then yes, I think there should be at least correlation between the number of change orders that come from that and how reliably we are meeting commitments and how effectively the team is improving around that. If that wasn't the right question, please restate it in the chat and I'll answer it again in the offline document later.
Fantastic. So LCI, myself, and Kristen would like to thank all of you for attending. A copy of the recording and the slide deck will be sent to all of the participants, just so you guys will know and be watching your inboxes for that. We did have a question about the books that I'd like to answer. They are available on Amazon. They are available for purchase on the LCI website. And the Transforming Design and Construction book, there you go. That is available for corporate members in the corporate member section of the website itself. So please be sure if you are a corporate member, I know the gentleman who is asking this question feel free to log into the corporate member center and take a peek and look for that Transforming Design and Construction in our Knowledge Transfer Learning Center. So again, everyone, thank you so much for attending, and we look forward to see you on our next webinar, which I do believe is also with Christian Pikel, who will be doing...
Oh, wait. That's right.
who will be doing the last planner system in construction. So we look forward to seeing you on that one. You guys have a great day and stay safe. Bye-bye.
Thanks, everyone.